Welcome to Velina's talk. My guest today is Nitin Gokhale. He's media entrepreneur with 40 years of professional experience in media across print, broadcast, and web mediums, with a special focus on security and defense related issues. He's also experienced chief executive officer. He's editor in chief of two important platforms, Bharat Shakti on the one side, founded in November 2015, and Strat News Global, launched in January 2020. And last but not least, he is also a very dear friend of mine, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome him to this conversation.
Thank you, Velina. It's a pleasure, real pleasure, and I'm aware that this is your last podcast before you head off for a vacation, well-deserved vacation, I must say. So it's a privilege and an honor to join you in this telecast or broadcast.
It's also a privilege and honor to host you. This is not the first time and certainly not the last time, and we have a lot to unpack. But before we start, of course, with most urgent topics, namely the conversation today is titled Lessons from Sri Lanka's Crisis, I would also like to outline that this podcast is possible thanks to the cooperation with Bharat podcast, which is one of India's most important podcast producers in policy, politics, and society. So, my first question, Nitin, is actually related to Sri Lanka. Would you give us a short overview from your point of view? You have also posted informations and analysis on your platforms. The government of Sri Lanka has collapsed. The president abandoned the country amid nationwide popular protests. But is this crisis only related to Sri Lanka? Is it going to have spillover effects? What is also India's point of view?
Well, a lot to unpack, as you said, and over the weekend, Sri Lanka has witnessed unprecedented scenes and an uprising which was spontaneous, which was amorphous in many ways. There was no leadership, there was no central organization that got people together to come and march on the presidential palace or the presidential office in Colombo, which is the capital. Now, the situation was building up for some time. I was there in April this year, about 3 months ago. And that time, the countdown had started in a way because the country has been facing shortages in food, fuel, medicines, essential items, because the country ran out of foreign exchange reserves. And again, it's an accumulated problem over the last 20 years almost, where reckless borrowing from the market, reckless loans, which were unsustainable, vanity projects, which were not required for the country, all that combined to bring the beautiful island country to this current mess that they find themselves in. But there is a lesson, and that's your main question actually. There is a lesson for smaller countries across Asia and Africa, where the Chinese model of extending loans to these smaller nations has been in fashion. Sri Lanka is one of the prime examples where the Chinese did some of these projects, big, huge infrastructure projects, which they gave the money for, but the country couldn't pay it back in time. And when they couldn't pay it back, they took equity in these projects. They sort of started taking up ownership, part ownership of these projects in a sovereign country. Also, the other lesson is that in a fluid situation like today, where there's a Russia-Ukraine war, fuel prices have gone much higher than expected or what they were in the past decade, has meant that smaller countries with very minimal foreign exchange reserves will always be under pressure. Around India, there is Pakistan facing the same problem. There is Nepal facing similar issues about low foreign exchange reserves. And these countries are also watching the situation in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, of course, is part of, as I said, a problem has arisen because the successive governments from 2000 onwards or a little earlier than that did not bother about how they are going to repay these loans and the interest on these loans. So long as the tourism was booming, and it depends on tourism for foreign exchange earnings. Nearly 30% of foreign exchange comes from the dollars come from tourism in Sri Lanka. Then another 5 to 6% comes from the remittances of expat Sri Lankans all over the world. All that got halted because of one culprit, and that is COVID 19, China. So the moment COVID 19 hit Sri Lanka, it managed the COVID 19 pandemic very well. It did not allow too many people to die or too many people to fall sick. But its tourism industry became sick because tourists were not allowed to come in. The strict lockdowns were there. And so the entire industry, which was sustaining partly the government earnings in foreign exchange, just collapsed. A lot of Sri Lankans lost their jobs abroad and they came back. So their remittances in foreign exchange or in dollars also came down to a trickle. And then, of course, there were a couple of mistakes that the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, did. He brought down the tax rates of the value added tax by 50% to meet what he had promised, or to fulfill his promise in the elections of November 2019. That meant that the government had no revenue to speak of. And then, of course, he banned chemical fertilizers for agriculture, which meant that the productivity in the agriculture sector went down and the food prices just rocketed to unprecedented levels, bringing in more hunger, more misery to the people and the farmers. So all this combined to see the collapse of the government in what we are seeing. But that's one part. Now the government has collapsed, but the question is, the International Monetary Fund, which is willing to give out a bailout package, needs to engage with somebody in Sri Lanka. Now, who is that somebody? If there is no government, if there's no stability, there is no political clarity on who's heading the government or who's going to head the government, then the IMF is not going to really be happy to extend any loan or give any help to Sri Lanka. India, in the meantime, has given since January this year, or a little earlier than that, till now, about $3.8 billion in different kinds of assistance to Sri Lanka by sending fuel ships, medicines, giving cash to buy food from abroad or from the open market, and trying to overcome the misery for the people. And as India said yesterday in an official statement, India's Ministry of External Affairs said that we stand by the people of Sri Lanka. They have not taken sides one way or the other of politicians. But the final point I want to make about Sri Lanka here is that the anger against politicians of all colors, of all hues, amongst the people is huge, because they feel that the politicians have let them down. Remember, just 2.5 years ago, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected with an overwhelming 52% vote, and his party that supported him, his brother's party, SLPP, also won an overwhelming mandate in the parliament. All that it took to overturn that mandate, that support, is this economic misery. So there is a lesson for everybody in various ways, how not to manage economy, how not to borrow beyond your capacity, and how one must have reserves to meet the exigencies during a rainy day, which is what the Russia-Ukraine war has brought upon the world. India is battling high fuel prices too, because India imports 70% of its energy needs from abroad, and oil prices do impact India's economy too. But we are a bigger country, bigger economy, better managed, and those problems are not there in India. But as I said, smaller countries around India do have a problem, and there are lessons they must be watching and learning and trying to implement from what happened in Sri Lanka. Velina?
Question, and that is related still to Sri Lanka, because you mentioned China, and China is well invested in Pakistan and in Myanmar, specifically when we look at these two huge economic corridors. Do you anticipate spillover effects, for instance, specifically for Pakistan, you name it, by the way, and Myanmar, that can also result in broader instability, economic instability in the region.
Oh, indeed, it will, especially in Pakistan. Myanmar can still abandon the projects and get away with it because they haven't they haven't progressed much beyond a certain point, which can not impact the projects really. But in Pakistan, the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has been in the works for almost 8 years now, 9 years now, from 2013, and China has invested a lot of money there. But Pakistan is unable to pay back that money, and now that Pakistan is going to the IMF or has gone to the IMF, it will again desire and again demand scrutiny of the books, which is what the IMF does, and which is what China does not like. So China has started asking for repayment of some of that loans and grants that they have given to Pakistan, which is going to put further pressure on Pakistan really and Pakistan's economy. Fuel prices have been already increased there beyond any other level that has been seen in the past, and Pakistan has no revenue to speak of except for the bailout given by the Chinese for a number of years. In Myanmar, the situation is slightly different because there the Chinese were already doing those projects by owning those projects. The Myanmaris had no money to speak of to begin with, and therefore all the money that is invested in the projects in Myanmar are Chinese money, whereas Pakistan had paid part of the project cost with China in the CPEC. That's the fundamental difference. But yes, both are under pressure, and both can collapse anytime. In fact, one of the reasons that the Pakistanis want to uh, have peace with India, or at least have pretense of a peace with India, is the economic situation that we are seeing right now in Pakistan.
Which maybe is one of the really rare good news for the region, given the growing tensions between China and
Excuse me.
India. But about that a little bit later. First,
Yes.
I would like to move to Japan. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was fatally shot on last Friday ahead of Japan's elections for the upper house of the parliament. And he has been, in fact, the architect of the free and open Indo-Pacific. He has been a big friend of India. Do you anticipate actually a change or shift in the regional affairs, as well as also US Japan bilateral relations following this really unspeakable tragedy? What is your anticipation for Japan's future policy towards the Indo-Pacific, and specifically Japan-India, of course, relations is something that we need to consider
Yeah,
as well.
it's a very good perspective from an analyst like you, because very often we see many of these policies revolve around one or two personalities driving them, and definitely Shinzo Abe was one of them who actually articulated, conceptualized the Quad. He spoke about the democracy diamond by trying to get India, Australia, Japan, and the United States together. He spoke about it for the first time in the Indian Parliament in 2007, as you will recall, and then, of course, sort of lent his full weight in trying to propagate Quad and the Indo-Pacific and free and open Indo-Pacific. So certainly that's a big loss. And behind the scene, he did control one major faction of the ruling party in Japan. So his absence will be felt first by the Japanese, second by, I would think, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was a personal friend of Shinzo Abe. You would have read a very heartfelt tribute he wrote about his friend Shinzo Abe, Abe-san, as he called him. So that, of course, is a personal loss. But institutionally, I think the India-Japan relationship is far deeper and structurally in a very good position to continue to do what they set out to do many years ago, nearly 15 years ago. And I would think that Japan has no choice but to continue with the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, also lend its weight to Quad, and continue to have good relations with the United States, even while they're trying to change their own pacifist constitution and give more teeth to the defense forces, and also make sure that China does not overrun Japan in any future conflict or any future tension between the two sides. So I think it's a very interesting um, situation at the moment in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific, that Japan will find it difficult to replace Shinzo Abe for a while at least. His stature, his charisma, his contacts are something that cannot be replicated suddenly. But Japan is also an old democracy, and it will survive, it will sort of flourish in the years to come. It's the United States which will have to play a major role in making sure that Japan doesn't deter, doesn't veer from the path that has been guided by Shinzo Abe. And I think there again, United States as well as India will play a major part in keeping this going. And I am very confident that the Quad and the Indo-Pacific compact between these four democracies will continue to get strengthened. Whether it will have a military aspect to it or whether it will have a military dimension to it will depend on what India wants to do. But that's a different question going forward. India wants to, do a lot of things with the Quad, but not necessarily military alliance or a military compact with the Quad countries for its own problems with China, which is the big elephant outside the tent right now. It's not inside the room, it's outside the tent, but it is there. The shadow of the dragon, as the Chinese are known, is very much there on the Quad, and which I thought Shinzo Abe would have been able to manage behind the scene too. But now that he's gone, I think it's going to be a uphill task, which of course the current leaders will find ways to meet and make sure that the challenge does not go beyond a point from the Chinese as far as the Indo-Pacific and the Quad is concerned.
Um, Kind of a provocative question. You can just answer very shortly if you like. Given the rise of the dragon in the Indo-Pacific, will we witness AUKUS turning into jacuzzi in the long term, with Japan and India joining the security and defense pact between the three signees, namely United States, UK, and
Australia.
Australia?
Well, see, it will depend. I mean, I know it's provocative enough, but I would answer that. I will answer it with a condition that the Chinese become more irrational than they are right now. If they become more irrational than they are, then and if they provoke both Japan and India simultaneously, then these two countries will automatically join what is AUKUS and become Jacuzzi, as you mentioned. Because India has so far tried to maintain the balance that when it comes to dealing with China, it wants to deal militarily, bilaterally with China, while there is backing, there is support from other people, other nations like the other three in the Quad. But India has said it will deal with China on its own, which it has over these past 3 or 4 years, or 5 years, I would say, from 2017 onwards. But the challenge for the challenge is for the Chinese rather than India and Japan. The challenge for the Chinese is how much do they push Japan and India into the arms of AUKUS by their actions. And if they are a long term player, as everybody tends to credit them, that they think long term, they have policies for long term, they anticipate events, then they won't do that. Because if they do push India, and if push comes to shove, India and Japan both will not hesitate to join this compact militarily against China, and which will be a disaster for China.
You mentioned the standoff, and I would like you to unpack the standoff between China and India a little bit. You have been traveling to the line of actual control. You have been visiting all of these places. There was a significant skirmish between the two Asian giants in 2020. The anticipation is that there will be further military tensions between them, with India being en route to becoming a significant economic power, and China trying to sustain its geoeconomic clout in the region and beyond. What is your anticipation? So first, give us a little kind of overview of the standoff, and then, of course, your personal anticipation for where this relationship is going in 2022. Do you foresee any possible military tension between them prior to the Congress of the Communist Party of China, as most of the experts have been actually pointing to likelihood of a military attack on Taiwan. I do not share this view, but I still am kind of cautious when it comes to the relations between China and India, whether this could not be a let's say, foreign policy terrain for the Chinese Communist Party, for Xi Jinping and his leadership to also seek some foreign policy adventure ahead of the Congress to draw, of course, the attention of the population away from the domestic problems.
True, true. I will come to that response for that question about CCP's Congress and whether they will attack India. But let me give you an overview over the past 2 years what happened in the summer of 2020, and since then what has happened. So the Chinese did, of course, aggressively move near the line of actual control where they had not moved previously. Initially, there was a surprise. India was caught by surprise in the sense that while it knew that the Chinese were exercising in Aksai Chin, which is a plateau next to the line of actual control on the Chinese side, or has been under Chinese control for 60 years now. But once the surprise was over, the Indian response is what surprised the Chinese. It was soldier for soldier, tank for tank, aircraft for aircraft. The Indians stood up. They deployed equal number of troops and other military assets, which was not anticipated by the Chinese. The Chinese thought, and this is again rooted in their old thinking. They have not updated their thinking about what the current dispensation in India is, or how the military in India has changed over these past 10, 15 years, that they did not anticipate that this response of matching deployments and equal aggression will come from India. So that resulted in what we call the standoff. Although there was this skirmish at Galwan on June 15th, 2020, in which India lost, and India declares its losses in the war and the people that loses in the war. So India lost 20 soldiers. One estimate from the Indian side and from the dribs and drabs of information that comes from the Chinese is that they lost something like 45 soldiers, which is a big loss for the Chinese. They've never seen bloodshed after 1979 in a war, in a hot war. So that forced the Chinese to go on the back foot. You are aware of the disengagement process which began in January 2021, February 2021 rather. And the I'm sorry, there was some problem with the power, but I hope this is enough.
Oh
Uh,
yes, we can see you very well, and the most important thing is that we can hear you very well.
yeah, yes. So, right. The thing is, yeah, there you are. This is fine. Uh, the basic thing is that the Chinese were caught by surprise of the Indian response. So the standoff continued from January 2021. There was 3 or 4 steps taken for disengagement of troops where they were face to face, eyeball to eyeball confrontation. That at some certain places they have gone back and sort of stepped back from each other's throats. But there are certain issues remaining as far as the standoff is concerned, which India is insisting that the status quo ante as it existed in May 2020 must be restored. And for that, there is already 14 rounds of negotiations have taken place between military commanders. One more round is expected very soon. So on that front, tactically, things are under I would say, control. As they used to say, situation tense but under control. So the number of troops remain deployed. They are eyeball to eyeball. They've spent 2 winters, which are very harsh at that altitude, and not very conducive for human beings to be deployed there continuously. But India has managed that because India has had the experience of being deployed at those heights for quite some time. It is the Chinese which are probably facing the problem, and they want this to be resolved going forward. That's the situation as far as tactical on ground deployment is concerned, where I have traveled to both Arunachal Pradesh, where there is no standoff, and to Ladakh, where there has been a standoff. But coming to your question about what next, what is the future, and I would think that the future is anybody's guess. My guess, since you asked me my guess, I think the Chinese would like to keep this at a threshold where there is no war, or there is no compulsion for India to launch an all-out offensive. So they will continue to do these small skirmishes, pinpricks, as it were, by trying to intrude into one area, then India trying to stopping them, and then India trying to do something else. This is what they will do. So I think India has now come to a stage where it anticipates the Chinese moves very quickly, and has also taken measures to punish the Chinese, not just militarily by keeping the troops at those harsh altitudes for a prolonged period by being equally aggressive, but also economically and otherwise. So you are aware of how India has banned those apps, the Chinese apps. It is facing, its companies are facing much more scrutiny in the Indian business environment. All that is happening. But if you really ask me, uh, whether Xi Jinping will risk a skirmish or an attack on India before the party congress in October will depend on how strong is the pushback against him for all his policies in the past couple of years. The next 2 months, August and September, would be crucial to watch. If Xi Jinping feels he's back to the wall and he needs a diversion, and I agree with you that while Taiwan would be on everybody's mind, it is not easy to attack Taiwan because there will be repercussions, there will be backlash from the world. Whereas any small skirmish or any attack on India on the land border, now that's an important thing. On the land border in Arunachal Pradesh or in Ladakh, will be left for India to respond rather than the other countries in the Quad or in the Indo-Pacific, because they don't have any stakes in India-China border skirmish that way. So yes, if the attack happens, and depending on what Xi Jinping does internally or what he faces internally, then India is prepared for taking on that challenge. And if it comes, it will come there in the next couple of months. August and September, they are also the months of summer, relatively better months and better days. So let's hope that Xi Jinping doesn't get pushed too hard to the wall and does not launch this. But if he does, India, I think, is now more than ready, more than ready than what it was in say 2020 to take on any Chinese misadventure.
Maybe a small technical question in addition. Are there any observations and reliable information regarding the deployment of Chinese troops along the line of actual control or near the land border? There were many reports, but I'm somehow not convinced that they are reliable. What is your information whether the number of Chinese troops increased? Some reports said even 50,000. As I said, I'm not in the position to validate this information. And the second, I think, technicalities regarding S-400, the Russian air defense system that has been delivered to both China and India. Do you think that it may be deployed on both sides of the common border at some point of time? And obviously, Russia in this particular case is playing a kind of controversial role, right? On the one side, of course, stable, long-term strategic partner of India, but on the other side, engaging with the dragon bear, this kind of tactical,
Your your
asymmetrical.
your definition of dragon bay. You are the one who coined that term.
Yeah, so tactical, asymmetric, kind of modus vivendi of coordination that is meant for this transitionary period of the international global affairs, for the international relations.
Oh, indeed. In fact, it's an important question. The number of troops remain constant since what they were, say, in October 2020 or August 2020, which is about 60,000 on both sides, both on the Indian side as well as on the Chinese side. What has changed on the Chinese side is they did not have permanent infrastructure for basing these troops in, say, 2020 or early 2021. But since then, they have dug up the place and has established permanent bases at tactically important locations. Now, that is something that has changed, which is also true as far as India is concerned. India did not have so many troops in Ladakh, for instance, to take on the Chinese. But because the Chinese have done that, India has also been forced. In fact, it has telescoped its 5 year plan into doing it in 2 years, implementing that plan in 2 years of infrastructure development, getting more facilities for the troops, living habitats, and also getting the logistics right, which again India has also done like the Chinese. So the positions have hardened in a way that it will only lead to a stalemate going forward, and India is not an aggressor. What India will do is, if Chinese try any misadventure, it will certainly stand up firmly, given what it has done now in the past 2 years or so. So I think the Chinese, if they need to defeat India decisively, overwhelmingly, then it needs to bring at least 7 times the current strength of its troops to that area, which again I doubt whether the Chinese want to do that. That will go up to almost 700,000 troops to come into that harsh terrain and territory, which I think the Chinese will not risk at this point in time. So I think we are looking at a stalemate, looking at a military standoff to continue, which bleeds both sides. Of course, it hurts India in a bigger way than the Chinese, because India is a smaller economy than China. But India is resilient enough and has deep pockets over the years it has developed to absorb that kind of shock, which it has done in the past 2 years or so, as far as spending is concerned or funding the troops deployment is concerned.
Another hotspot in the current global affairs is the ongoing war launched by Russia on February 24th against Ukraine. It changed completely the whole European security order. Currently, Russia already has the whole province of Lugansk under the control of the Russian troops, and more than 50% of Donetsk, the other province in the Donbass, in the east of Ukraine. It has also enlarged its positions in the south of Ukraine. But the war is far from over. Nobody can tell whether it will take a few more months or actually a few more years. And also, on the behalf of the Ukrainian government, there are already plans actually for counterstrikes, for instance, in the south of Ukraine. India has, of course, its own view on the war, and it has, as I already said, very stable, long-term oriented strategic partnership with Russia that is derived from many strategic issues from the time of the Cold War up until now, and it will actually further regard Russia as a strategic partner, no matter the developments in Europe. I think that this sums up, and as a European, this is, I think, the cold-blooded realpolitik situation. But can you give us a little bit more from India's point of view, how India, the Indian government, is regarding, of course, this war and also the anticipation for the post-war European security order. What is also the role India wants to play given this shifting reality in the on the old continent? Just as a reminder, currently the bilateral relationship between the European Union, that means the institutions, but also European powers and India, has never been at such a high in terms of free trade agreement negotiations, which were put on hold in 2013, Indo-Pacific strategies being actually adopted in several key European powers. In Europe, there is this very positive, or at least it was this positive mood, of course, before the war, because it drew the attention towards Russia once again. But the anticipation is that Europe and India can actually pursue a third way in order to not get caught between the systemic rivals China and United
United
States.
States.
So, what is the common view right now, the anticipation, and also probably the future policy of India when it comes to the when it comes to Russia, but also when it comes to the old continent?
Well, a lot to unpack there, and a very important question. I think in India there are two levels of understanding as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned. One is that uh, the Russians haven't really put everything that they can or they could in pursuing this war or prosecuting this war. It is still being regarded by Indian decision makers as a special operations, as mentioned by President Putin uh, against Ukraine. So the outcome of this thought school of thought is that this will continue and this will be a prolonged kind of an operation. The skirmishes will go on. There will be ups and downs between the two sides, and therefore we have to be prepared to face the consequences or the fallout of this prolonged skirmish or prolonged fight between the two sides. That's point number one. Point number two is that while India's relationship with Russia is certainly important in many ways, Russia is also a supporter in the P5 in the United Nations, and of course now France has taken over that responsibility in many ways. So, but the defense relationship remains very robust and very dependent on the Indian side on Russia. S-400 you mentioned, India has got delivery of two of those six systems that it has ordered, but it is yet to disclose where those systems are being deployed. You're right about anticipating it that it will be deployed on the Chinese border, but my sense is that because China has the same system, India will try and first deploy those systems on the Pakistan border, but will continue to press Russia for more such systems because it's one of the most effective uh, air defense systems in the world. That said, India is also diversifying its supply chain as far as defense industry or defense equipment is concerned. It is going in a big way to create an Indian industry, Indian ecosystem under what is called in Indian language Atmanirbharta, that is self-reliance in defense, by encouraging, by supporting, and by giving more opportunities to Indian companies, even if they will go and initially collaborate with bigger defense giants and defense manufacturers. So Russia-Ukraine is war is actually, and mind you, it was not just Russia, but it was also Ukraine, which was a major supplier of defense platforms to India after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Many of our gas turbine engines for the ships come from Ukraine, used to come from Ukraine. Now, what happens to that? The Indian Navy will have to anticipate. While it has reserves for over the next 2 years for replacement of those engines, but what happens if this operation or this war goes on for over the next 2 years? That is the anticipation that India will have to do. Coming to the larger strategic relationship between India and the European nations, I think India is separating its approach to European nations on the FTA, on technology green technology coming from Scandinavian countries, European countries into India. From it is decoupling all those decisions from India's stand vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war, which is not liked by many people in the West. It has been criticized. India has been criticized, but as it has said a number of times by, I mean, India has said, and many of its leaders have articulated that India has decided to put national interest above principles when it comes to siding with Russia in this crucial uh, skirmish or crucial, I would say, confrontation that is going on between the two sides on European soil. I mean, that's something that India has decided to go ahead with because, to bring the final angle to this, that India is also aware that if it cuts off Russia or starts siding with anti-Russian forces, then Russia will go fully into the Chinese camp and not then have any sense of balance when it comes to relationship with India and other nations which it wants relationship with. So therefore, I think what is the main issue here is that India is trying to strike a balance between China and Russia, and knowing that Russia is today dependent more and more on the Chinese equipment, Chinese money, Chinese support. So India is therefore utilizing this opportunity to try and see to it that the balance between these three countries, who are also members of the SCO and the BRICS on one side, is maintained. And therefore, the approach that India has taken as far as Russia-Ukraine war is concerned.
And a final question goes in the direction of the future of the global order, because obviously India will play an increasingly important role and will also reposition itself as a major regional and why not one day even global player. And I argued that Russia would have never launched a war against Ukraine on February 24th if Moscow had not relied on the overt, extensive, and comprehensive support by China. So there is one systemic layer in this decision by the Russian president, namely to also amplify the systemic competition between United States and China by pressuring China to position itself, which Beijing was reluctant to do before that, but to pressure China basically to side with Moscow, and by doing so to accelerate the systemic competition, to basically trigger Cold War 2.0 in the international relations. Obviously, we are still in this transitionary period. We don't know exactly whether it will result in a multipolarity with several different poles led by regional or guided by regional players, or will we end with Americana Pax Americana 2.0 after 30 years of in temporary unipolarity and then transitionary international relations, given the strong US dollar, given that the dollar is still global reserve currency number one, and you already outlined for us what it means if you don't have foreign exchange reserves. Other countries will be obviously in the same position, or will be put in the same position in the second half of the year. But still, what do you think will be India's position in this transitionary period of the international relations? If you look at all these important, relevant regional constellations where India has become part of, like the Quad, the talks with the AUKUS powers in the Indo-Pacific, but on the other side also being member of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, having this special relationship with Russia. So basically also kind of being involved with the dragon bear. How is India going to position itself if the global system really moves towards a new bifurcation along these two major blocks of powers?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the frustrating points about India that I hear increasingly from my friends in the West is, can't it choose the side of what is right? So my counter question, based on my conversations in the Indian system, is that what is right? Who decides? Is it what right is for Europe and United States? Is it right for India? Because the geographical location of India and the very fact that India, amongst the four Quad countries, let's say, is the only country which faces a land contested land border with China, and a China which is backed by Russia, uh, compels India to strike a balance between how it deals or bilaterally deals with China on one hand, and in a multilateral or a trilateral organization like the SCO and the BRICS, or four cornered organization like the BRICS, between Russia, China, and India. That is one challenge that India has, and which is trying to sort of create a situation where all three become important for those platforms or those groupings. That's one part of India's approach. Second part is that India is not averse to getting closer to the West and to the Quad member countries, and trying to be a power which I call, or others have called it, I'm sure, as swing power. That it is a power which can actually make a difference, and trying to get the two sides talking. People have asked this question: why can't India get Russia and United States together, or talking to each other? Why can't it play a role of the mediator? Now, the answer to that is, historically, India has shied away from being a mediator or a facilitator. That might change as the confidence grows, and as India becomes stronger economically and has the awareness about what's happening around the world. India might do that. But as far as Europe is concerned, India is very clear what it wants from Europe. It wants technology, it wants friendly relations, it wants environment protection and climate change mitigation in collaboration with the European nations. While it still depends on Russia on defense equipment, it doesn't mind getting technology for defense from the European countries, and giving the kind of impetus that is needed for getting Europe to be involved in the Indo-Pacific. So Germany, Britain, France, France in fact it calls itself the Indian Ocean Power. So India wants to be a player in its own backyard, which is Indian Ocean region, parts of Central Asia, which are closer to Russia, and of course South Asia and Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, but not go beyond that at the moment. As you said, who knows whether it becomes a global player or not? But it certainly wants to uh, punch its weight according to what its size is and where it is located and where it is headed at the moment, both economically and militarily. So that's where I would think the striking of the balance is being sought by India. And I think all the major global players are aware of this tightrope walk that India does or has to do, given what the situation is globally.
Mhm. Well, as I tend to say, I said this at the Resina conference while sitting next to the Indian foreign minister, Jain Shankar, that in fact currently the United States needs India more while facing the dragon bearer than India needs the US while facing China in South Asia and in the broader Indo-Pacific. But this is, of course, when it comes to hard power, and European powers will still have to learn, or let's say, relearn the language of hard power. But we will need another
True.
session to address all of these issues. I see that there are a few questions in the chat room, and I will probably address two of them just for the end of this session. That one is actually related to Sri Lanka. I think that the audience is still very much interested in what is going on there. So the question goes in the direction of your opinion about Sri Lanka entering a sort of association agreement with India. What is your view on that?
Well, I think India will be a little wary of that, given the history of the relationship between India and Sri Lanka over the past nearly 70 years. Sri Lanka and India have had love-hate relationship. It has had ups and downs. They've gone the two extremes because there are uh, ethnic realities which cannot be ignored. There is a substantial Tamil population in Sri Lanka's north, which identifies itself with their Indian Tamil cousins, and ethnically they feel close to India. But the majority Sinhala Buddhist population resents India's has resented in the past, about nearly 30 years ago, India's direct intervention in Sri Lanka, or even the kind of association that one is thinking of. But what India is very clear about is that it will unconditionally support Sri Lanka as far as it can go uh, in trying to mitigate the current economic mess, without entering into any formal agreement or without putting any preconditions to what it wants in return from Sri Lanka, because it is an important neighbor, a friend, and a spot where India needs to be constantly present in a benign way. There are no military designs that India has on Sri Lanka, and therefore, I would think India will not want to, like it is wary of military alliance with the United States, for instance, or joining any of such AUKUS or any of those military alliances with the United States. It will be similarly chary. It will be similarly wary about doing any formal agreement with Sri Lanka, given the sensitivities involved on both sides.
And there is also another question that is related to India's view on Germany. How does India actually look at Germany? Germany, as we know, is the industrial heart of Europe, is the most important economic partner for actually all European Union members, but it's also, of course, still being perceived as a major economic power in the international relations. So, what is the view from India on Germany? Is Germany being regarded as declining economic power, and specifically now, given all these challenges that the German government is facing with the transition, with the energy transition, now that there is also fear of actually gas embargo coming from Russia.
Russia.
Is it rather positive or a rather negative view that Germany will overcome these difficulties and challenges? And in fact, Europe will be still on the rise as an economic bloc, or rather on decline?
I think you yourself have answered these questions earlier during our chat conversations in the past. That the Europeans have lost the stomach for a fight. At least that's the view in India. The use of hard power. If, this become kind of a disempowered continent for some time, since the past 4 decades, I would say. But that again is changing, is what the view is in India, that it has woken up from its slumber. And while there will be temporary downturn in Germany's economy because of the energy transition and the energy dependence it has on Russia, Germany is too strong a power to be put down. Or, I mean, when I say power, in terms of its technology, in terms of its engineering skills, in terms of its manufacturing abilities, Germany is too strong to be kept down. And I think if there is a downturn, again, I'm no expert on economy or the way things will crystallize in coming months. Even if there is a downturn, and even if there is a setback for Germany, for Germany, it will be temporary, and Germany will again take its rightful place as an industrial powerhouse, if not a hard military power straight away over the next 3 or 4 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been with us for the last 60 minutes, and my dear friend and colleague Nitin Gokhale actually responded to all my questions. Please make sure to follow him on Twitter, where he has also posted his two most important platforms that you can also click on and find more information if you're interested. Nitin, thank you very much for staying with us for actually 60 minutes. We agreed on less, but in the end, I received all your attention, and I really wish you much success with all your undertakings and plans for the second half of the year.
Thank you very much, Velina, and you have a great holiday ahead. This chat has really refreshed me. I had a small break because of some health setbacks, and this is the first long conversation I have had, which has refreshed my mind and has given me some food for thought by your very intelligent and very thought provoking questions. So, thank you for that opportunity, and see you on the other side.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for your extensive and honest answers to my questions, for giving us so much information, specifically for those outside of South Asia. It's always very helpful to get the information firsthand. We will be back with more for sure. And as I said, much success to all your plans and undertakings.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you.